Good afternoon, FIR ambassadors. Welcome to this FIR webinar on unconscious bias. I'm Liz Holford. I'm the Lead Consultant Action Sustainability and the Fairness, Inclusion and Respect Programme Director. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined online by two extremely knowledgeable people, by Lynn Hunt, who many of you will have met. She's one of our FIR trainers, and she's Director of the Ethical Trading Company, and by Aaron Reid, who also many of you will know. He's the Head of Sustainable Procurement at Balfour Beatty UK. He's also a member of our Fairness, Inclusion and Respect Steering Group, so he helps provide direction to what the programme does. And he has worked in the FIR and EDI space for a very long time, and so has a great deal of experience and some really valuable perspectives on the agenda. A key priority of the Fairness, Inclusion and Respect programme is to engage with small, medium enterprises. So we would really like to know how many of you work for small, medium enterprises. So about 2/3 of you have answered that question. At the moment, 44% of you are saying no, you don't work for a small, medium enterprise. And 17% of you who are online are saying that yes, you do work for a social enterprise. So we'll close that off. Thank you for that, and we will move on to the body of the webinar. So the learning objectives for today are that by the end of today's webinar, you will first of all understand what unconscious bias is and why it matters. Secondly, know where to go for more information about how to manage it. And thirdly, appreciate how unconscious bias training fits into an organisational approach to making workplaces more inclusive. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Lynn, who's going to pick up on what unconscious bias is and why it's important to us.
Hi there, welcome, and I'm going to run through in around 10 or 15 minutes a little bit about why this matters, what it is, etc. So let's start at the beginning with what it is, a definition. And the first thing to say is it's our unintentional preferences, formed by all sorts of things, socialization experiences, right from the word go, school, friends, family, experiences, those kind of things. And you can see there that we implicitly assign positive and negative categories to group and people. You think of the thousands and thousands of pieces of data that we process every day, thoughts, sights, sounds, smells. We can't possibly objectively analyze every single one. We just don't have the time. So we assign categories. For example, you hear people say, oh, he seems nice, or she looks like a nice person. We're consistently assigning. So, for example, you see from this picture that we can instantly tell she's got blonde hair, she's visibly angry, and she likely has a few choice words for us. Without any effort whatsoever, you experienced fast thinking. But when we look at this problem, something different happens. It's a multiplication problem. You could solve it if you want to. Many of you probably didn't bother. And if you did, it would have taken a bit more time and effort. And for me, it would have taken a good calculator as well. So you slowed down. This one to solve requires more effort. It requires slow thinking. Now we need both. I mean, fast thinking is great, fight or flight. Literally, back in the days where we were surrounded by saber-toothed tigers, it wouldn't be awfully productive to say, well, let's slow down, let's be objective, let's analyze this. It's a mammal, etc., etc. We would make a snap decision, literally for life or death. So fast thinking has its place, but imagine you bring that fast thinking into the workplace and a new candidate, you're on an interview panel, a new candidate steps through the door and the thought pops unbidden into your head, I'm not sure they look like they'll fit in here. That's an example of fast thinking, and it's already subtly influenced how you may view that candidate. So there are two systems of fast and slow thinking, and this dictates much of our perception and reaction in life and work. Take a look at this. Bat and a ball cost £1.10. The bat costs £1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? First thing that pops into your head. Now, the first thing that pops into your head may have been 10p. You may have thought, 10p. You might have thought, 10p, but that's not quite right. Or you might have thought something else. The actual answer, for the record, is 5p, even though it appears to be 10p. Reason it's such is that if the ball was 10p, £1 more than 10p is £1.10, which equals £1.20. It can't be the right answer. The ball is actually 5p because £1 more than 5p is 105, which brings us to the answer we want of £1.10. I mean, that's the maths of it. But the thing behind it shows that actually if we fast think what we think the solution to be, 10p kind of made sense, it can actually delude us into the wrong answer. And that may not matter so much in a little maths problem like this for the sake of it, but take a look at this. Okay, again, it's the first thing that pops into your head. And it's a silly and unfair question because the answer is, well, he could do absolutely anything for a living. We can't tell by looking at him. But by looking at him, we will have formed an instant impression and we may have an idea of the things that we think he may do for a living. In point of fact, this is what he does for a living. And, why would we be surprised? And some of you may not be at all surprised. But the point is, this is how he looks in his day job. This is real, not made up. He's a pucker doctor. What's interesting is how he might be perceived by others and how this might differ according to assumptions made by others. And, and if you factor in as well as a photo, his voice, his accent, his body language, that kind of thing, that would influence, again, how we perceive that person. And again, this is an example of quick thinking. How long do you think it takes us to form an impression of somebody? The answer there is around it's actually only around 7 seconds that we form an impression of somebody. The thing about when we judge another person when we meet them, this thing about, oh, she looks nice, it's this quick thinking that allows unconscious bias, which we all have, to impact on the objectivity of our decisions. And there is a clear relationship between unconscious bias, prejudice and discrimination, which you can see on the slide there. We do tend to rely on stereotypes. Stereotypes do serve a purpose because clustering people into groups with expected traits helps us to navigate the world without being overwhelmed with information. The downside, of course, is that the potential for prejudice is hardwired into human cognition. Evidence is overwhelming that unconscious bias seeps into our business discussions into our business decisions in many ways. And if we consider the business impact of this, I mean, here's just a few examples. Recruitment is a biggie and it's an obvious one, isn't it? How we could make biased decisions, but it's also how we mentor people or not. I'm not talking about formal mentoring schemes, which tend to be more prescribed, but how we informally mentor, how we perhaps linger by somebody's desktop a little bit more, say, oh yeah, that's a great idea, that kind of thing. Have you thought about this? Project allocations, development opportunities, even how we listen. Do we listen to some people more avidly than others? Do we give their views more credence than others? And it's not just our colleagues and prospective colleagues, it's our customers, it's anybody in the supply chain. It's appraisal and performance, it's policy and marketing. And overall, it's to who we give the most time and attention. So it is worth thinking about. It does have, a huge impact. Here's a couple of examples. This one was a social experiment. Sorry about the jargon. BAME, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. People submitted job applications with what appeared to be white British names. They then and didn't get callbacks. And got callbacks. They then resubmitted their name with what appeared to be a Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic name and got far fewer callbacks. Just the change of the name altered that. And anecdotally, I've had many people on courses over the years say that either that's happened to them or it's happened to someone that they know. And I've also had people say that they've been advised to anglicise their name, and when they've done that, they've got more callbacks on jobs. That's just one example. Here's another one. This was a CIPD survey, a large sample survey size, around 1,500 HR professionals voluntarily tested on unconscious bias. There's a psychometric you can do, which we've given you the link a little bit later. But they found that they were unconsciously biased against women rather than men who they perceived to be overweight. They were horrified when they found out because they thought, well, we could be inadvertently missing the best talent, etc., etc. But the point is they were completely unaware that was the case. So that's a little overview of the business impact and how damaging it can be. Of course, there does need to be something that we can do about this. And the good news is that there are many, many things. One thing is to be aware of generalizations. Stereotypical views and generalizations creep into our language, for example, and that can inform our business culture. So one thing we can do is to listen and reflect on language used by us and our colleagues. Be alert for sweeping statements in conversations, meetings and reports. Things like, oh, the new trainees always want, or how are working mums never, those kind of things. We can challenge our decision making. We can get in the habit of asking, why am I thinking this way? Be particularly aware of first impressions and gut reactions in decision makings. Also, we're more vulnerable to unconscious bias when we're tired, stressed or overworked. So slow down, take a lunch break, don't spend all the things we miss because we're so busy. Don't spend 8 hours at the desktop without a break. Even, don't skip lunch because our sugar levels drop. Things like that. Slow down, be objective. You can take a test. The Harvard Implicit Association tests allow us to find where our own unconscious personal biases may lay, so we can reflect and take steps to reduce them. They're not a universal panacea. Read the diagnostic, read the writing before you take it first off. They're never to be used as a diagnostic or an assessment. They're purely for personal learning. Avoid groupthink. We all have a tendency to surround ourselves with people who are like us and who we feel comfortable with. And of course, that leads to affinity bias. So repeated shared decision making can lead to groupthink, which can have unintended consequences for others, particularly some that, others that aren't in that majority group. Work beyond our comfort zone, seek cognitive diversity, involve ourselves with people who have a different mindset to us and who think differently to us. So that's a very brief run through on what it is, what it does, why we need to be alert to it. There's some great materials in the FIR resource library. I'd like to divert you particularly to the e-learning module Leading People Inclusively, which will give you a greater insight. There's also, you'll see a whole load of useful links on the right hand side there, including the link to the Harvard Implicit Association test if you want to have a play with those, and lots of useful reading and watching. So thank you. I'll now hand over to Aaron.
Colleagues, hello, welcome, and thanks for joining. I'm just going to run you through something around unconscious bias training. There's no doubt unconscious bias exists, and unconscious bias training is often the kind of go-to solution for lots of different organisations looking at either starting their journey around EDI or EDI training and or in an attempt to address perceived bias in their own organisations. But you may or may not be aware that the whole concept of unconscious bias is quite a controversial subject within HR and EDI circles. There's lots been written and lots been said in various different bits of media about the subject. What I've done is, I don't know if these slides are going out afterwards, but what I've done is I've hyperlinked each of these articles, and so you can kind of read for yourself what's behind kind of all of them in a little bit more detail. But what I've also done is try to summarise kind of some of the key points from most of those articles in terms of what the issue is. There's certainly no doubt that unconscious bias training can help in terms of raising awareness, but clearly awareness alone isn't enough to create cultural change. And actually there's little or no evidence that in and of itself, cultural change, in and of itself, unconscious bias training leads to cultural change or any sort of sustained impact. And actually if the delivery is poor, then unconscious bias training has got the potential to backfire, either by making the majority group feel under attack and becoming defensive, or in some people can actively justify or reinforce the unconscious bias that they held. The quote at the bottom, I think, is, we all do this and so it's okay. There's nothing I can do about it. It's unconscious, and therefore it continues and is reinforced. The other issue, short or one-off training sessions certainly do not lead to cultural change. Unconscious bias training needs people to become aware of their own biases, but in addition to that, crucially, also provide actionable techniques for people to manage them. Research shows that debiasing individuals can be effective only under certain conditions, and there's a list there of what those conditions are in terms of awareness the possibilities of bias, understanding who is impacted, having immediate feedback when they fall prey to their biases, and a training program with regular feedback and coaching. In short, they need their own EDI personal trainer or coach alongside them at all times and on every day, and so isn't really very practical. And so there's a danger where people think I can just do a quick one-off sheep dip, couple of hours or half a day, and actually expect to see some sort of meaningful result from that. And I suppose, in short, if you want to make people aware of their biases, then unconscious bias training is certainly a useful thing to do. But actually, if you want to affect any sort of meaningful, lasting, sustained cultural change within your organisation, then you need to do something other than unconscious bias training, or at least in addition to unconscious bias training. But in and of itself, it's not the thing which is going to lead to a solution. And that's my personal difficulty with the subject, is people think we have an issue around EDI, or fairness, inclusion and respect. Let's do some unconscious bias training. Right, we're fixed. And clearly we're not. Many organisations have already started doing unconscious bias training in this sector. And I suppose it's fair to ask, is there any evidence that it's having any impact at all on improving the diversity of our sector? And you tell me. I'm not sure if you can see those slides. But what this shows is actually over a significant period of time, there has been no impact on the demography, the diversity of the workforce within our sector. Ethnic minority women, people with disabilities, has all flatlined. And I suppose for me, we always have to keep the outcome in mind. It's nice that we can do a bit of training and all feel good about ourselves, but if that doesn't lead to an improved or increased feeling of inclusivity, which then leads on to an increase in the diversity of the workforce, then actually, what are we doing this for? And I think increasingly we have to kind of have an evidence-led approach to everything that we do. And so we can try things, whatever it might be, unconscious bias training or not, review the evidence after a period of time. And if it hasn't worked, then we have to correct. But certainly from my reading of the data, there's been no significant increase. And in fact, in some areas, there's been a decrease in representation of underrepresented groups in our sector. So we certainly have to keep the outcomes in mind. There's a load of, there's kind of lots of articles being written. There's kind of some deep and heavy research that's been done by a number of kind of credible organisations. And again, what I've done is I've hyperlinked all of those logos and links, and so you can go in and read for yourself kind of the research that's been done about the effectiveness of unconscious bias training and different strategies for getting the most out of them if you are going to do them. And again, I've tried to summarise over the next couple of slides what those key things are in terms of, if you're going to do unconscious bias training, how to have the most successful session. The first one is about being clear on what you're trying to achieve and the reason why you're doing unconscious bias training. And to my mind, we've got to use a data-led approach to make sure that we focus on and address the issues that are relevant to the unique context of your own organisation. If you have an underrepresentation of ethnic minorities, but you're okay in terms of gender representation, then again, it makes sense to focus in on that, as opposed to having a generic or sheep dip type approach to training and expecting that to deliver some sort of results. Unconscious bias training must be part of a broader approach. It can't be something you do in isolation that isn't aligned to a broader activity and leadership messaging within your organisation, again, and expect it as a one-off piece of activity which jars with the existing culture and the messaging within your organisation and expect it to yield a result. It might be an interesting conversation for a couple of hours, and then people just go back to their old ways of doing things. And so, again, it must be part of a broader piece of activity. The key thing for me is obviously about having and securing experienced facilitators. There's lots of people out there masquerading as EDI trainers and deliverers of unconscious bias training, but for me, quality really needs to be seen to be believed. And so, you really need to do your homework to ensure that if you are going to get somebody to come in and deliver unconscious bias training, that they're actually capable of doing so. It needs to be very delicately and expertly handled, given the potential for those sessions to backfire and actually leave you in a worse position than you started. And so certainly speaking to trusted colleagues to get references and referrals of people who they've had success with is probably a good place to start. But certainly it's not something where you can just pick somebody out of the yellow pages and again expect to see some sort of results. And I suppose my final point is the obvious one, which is unconscious bias in and of itself is not a silver bullet. And my difficulty with it is often when I talk to people in different organisations, the only thing that's happening around fairness, inclusion and respect is unconscious bias training. And people often say, well, we're going to start with a bit of unconscious bias training and see what happens. But again, all of the evidence, and there is significant evidence out there, suggests that this is not a helpful way to proceed, and may actually backfire and certainly won't help you to deliver that cultural change or have that sustained impact that you might be looking for. So mine's just a word of caution. Certainly unconscious bias is something that we need to address. Certainly unconscious bias training is something which might help as part of a broader approach, but we really need to be very careful when we're considering it. So I hope my word of caution was useful or helpful and would help you think a bit more deeply about how you might approach it going forward. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn and Aaron. To apply that last thought of Aaron's, which is that unconscious bias training is not the silver bullet, and that it needs to be part of a wider approach. It's actually for that reason that there isn't explicit unconscious bias training within the FIR programme. It's why the materials that we have around unconscious bias are included in the Leading People Inclusively module, which Lynn flagged up, so that we are raising the issue, discussing the issue, and suggesting how people can manage unconscious biases within a wider perspective of leadership. And clearly Aaron was key to that approach being taken. So thank you, Aaron. We've got questions coming in. First question from Veronica. Could you please provide an example of how unconscious bias has adversely affected individuals or organisations? Lynn, can I come to you on that? Do you have an example of where there have been adverse impacts as a result of unconscious bias, please?
Hi. So in terms of an adverse impact, not directly, but it's kind of flipping. So I totally agree with Aaron's view, but it's kind of flipping what Aaron said. So where there's been an adverse effect is probably where there's been little or no impact. So it's a sheep dip approach. Let's put people through unconscious bias training. And the thing about it is, because it's quite intriguing, people really enjoy it. So you tend to get, the whole sort of happy sheets at the end of training. They look good. But of course, that's not really the point, is it? The point is what it does and what it changes. And I think that the problem with that kind of approach is that because you're saying it's unconscious bias, it almost allows people to go, oh, well, it's unconscious then, so it's not my fault. So really, apart from doing a bit of testing and thinking and slowing down, I don't really need to do anything. And of course, so it almost negates responsibility, which is, I'm not against it as part of a holistic approach, and very definitely linked to leadership behaviours, because it comes from the top. But I think it does go wrong if people are allowed to use it as a sticking plaster to every problem, because some biases are very conscious and some discrimination is very conscious.
Yeah, and not much more to add. The key one in terms of the negative impact is exactly as Lynn says, reinforces it and justifies to people, well, there's nothing I can do about it. It's unconscious, and so I'll have to. And also, as I mentioned, this whole thing about kind of majority group feeling under attack and being told there's something wrong with them and they need to be fixed, and people become resentful. And actually, as I say, you get exactly the opposite reaction that you're looking for. And so that's really the danger of it. But as Lynn said, for the most part, most people, it's a nice chat for a couple of hours, but actually, beyond a couple of hours and back to the pressures of the day job, we forget all about it. There has to be kind of ongoing and continued conversation, support, feedback in order to make it kind of effective.
So, Aaron, what does that broader approach look like in Balfour Beatty?
Balfour Beatty, I suppose, as with anybody, is definitely on a journey with this. But for us, certainly, it's around having policy. It's around having leadership signed up and visible and active in this space. It's about process and reviewing your recruitment processes in particular to identify and remove barriers. And that's, around having employee surveys where you can get feedback from your employers, but also working with your supply chain in terms of ensuring supplier diversity to look at, have we got barriers in our procurement process? It's about comms, internal, external, and the messaging that is around EDI inside and outside of your organisation. Affinity networks have been particularly effective in our organisation, both in terms of empowering individuals to speak, but also enabling the business to hear some of those things, some of those barriers which they might not necessarily have been aware of. And so, yeah, training on it by itself can't solve things. It can help people to think a little bit differently, but actually it's got to sit alongside some of that broader stuff. And certainly the key things, well, in fact, they're all key things, aren't they? You've got to have the policy, you've got to look at your processes, you've got to remove the barriers accordingly. Data, I suppose, is the other thing as well. You've got data. Don't just have data for the sake of data. You have data in order that you can identify where you need to focus your efforts in on. And sometimes just because the data isn't telling you what you would like it to tell you, that can be a good news story. Because if you're doing something that feels good, but actually isn't having the effect as evidenced through the data, then again, you can kind of look at it again and tweak your approach accordingly. So I think it's that, certainly we have this approach of kind of continually reviewing what we are doing in terms of the level of effectiveness it's having on the outcome we're trying to achieve, which is trying to have a more inclusive and diverse workforce. And ultimately, if all we're getting is a warm, fuzzy feeling, well, that's nice, but that's not actually what we're trying to achieve.
What about in terms of the very practical things that can be done to actually manage unconscious biases within businesses? And I'm thinking particularly about in recruitment here. So, for example, in shortlisting and recruitment, I'm hearing some of our school partners, for example, Network Rail, HS2, using name blind CVs to try and manage risk of biases in shortlisting. So, the data that Lynn flagged up is evidence of how that happens. And indeed, one of the resources in our resource library is a great film from the BBC that shows that somebody called Adam got 4 times more callbacks for jobs than the same CV sent under the name Mohammed. To what extent, Aaron, are you seeing very, very practical solutions being put in place by business to manage unconscious biases, and what are they?
Yeah, I mean, if I talk with my first steering group hat on in terms of kind of what I'm seeing across the sector more broadly, and specifically the blind CVs is one that's often talked about. And I think that there is undeniable evidence out there that when you do that, you do get more diverse candidate shortlists. It's a very effective way of kind of short-circuiting some of that unconscious bias. I think that it's not always easy because of the systems and processes that different organizations use technically to kind of implement that system, but wherever I've seen it implemented, it has always yielded an increase in diversity of the candidate shortlist. Ultimately, this isn't about positive discrimination. It is about positive action. It's about increasing the pool of diverse candidates that we can source from. But ultimately, and I suppose again, this is the other thing, it's not just about the shortlisting, it's also about the interview process. And again, looking at, do we have diversity on interview panels? Do we have more than 1 or 2 people on an interview panel? And challenging things like the groupthink that Lynn was talking about earlier on. So, it's clear the pinch points absolutely are the recruitment process, and crucially, that interview process and the interview panel as well. So certainly where I've seen those things actively addressed, it will always result in a more diverse workforce and arguably, access to the best of all available candidates, not just ones which look and feel like everybody else looks and feels around here.
Emma's messaged us with some really practical suggestions for how businesses can take action to manage unconscious biases. For example, challenging behaviours, challenging any generalisations that people make, providing positive role models of non-obvious prejudicial characteristics, and to provide formal sessions around that. Also, social events to enable us all to challenge our prejudices and our behaviours.
I think she's right, but again, just a note of caution. Giving people license to challenge without the tools and techniques to do that effectively, or without the support to give them the tools and techniques to do that effectively and professionally, can end really badly. And so, yes, absolutely agree. But again, just recognising that people will need support to do that.
Lynn, what are some practical examples that you've seen in businesses of things that are done to manage to enable unconscious biases to be managed?
I think practically a couple of things. I think one area where targeted unconscious bias training can be useful is in recruitment, is for recruitment panels targeted to that. Also looking at the processes, which I think Aaron's just discussed, to build in fairness. More generally, I think it starts with linking everything to the values, bringing the values to life, and then starting with the workforce, which is what is expected of them in terms of business behaviours, and letting them know that they can speak up and speak out if things are wrong, and that it's okay to do that, but equally that it's okay to make a genuine mistake and receive feedback about that, without being made to feel the worst person on the planet. Obviously, people don't continue to make those mistakes time after time. Secondly, it's getting managers in the position where they can manage so that they are managing difficult behaviours and at an early stage. And then, of course, as the FAIR approach is very much one of inclusive leadership, work with the leadership first, actually. Inclusive leadership, yes, which incorporates a little bit of awareness of unconscious bias, but it includes all sorts of other things as well, including, tangible strategies. So it's that 3-tier approach, I think, right from the beginning. It starts with induction, but it doesn't stop there. It carries on regularly. I think also building fairness, inclusion and respect into appraisals and reviews and one-on-ones, building a bit of accountability. So, asking people what they've been great at, but asking what they've done to action for initiatives and how it's improved and how it's changed.
Thanks, Lynn. We've got a question in about what can be done at site level around managing unconscious biases.
Kind of, sort of damage limitation at that point, isn't it, if it's been allowed to enter into everyday speech there. But it comes down to making it absolutely clear what's expected. It's not all unconscious bias. Sometimes it's quite conscious, but it's making it absolutely clear to everybody what's expected of them, the benefits to everybody when they get it right, and actually, without wishing to use the sort of stick approach, but actually the consequences, that there are real consequences for people when they do get it on, when they do speak in a way that's at odds with the value of the organisation, that brings that organisation into disrepute or disrespects one of their colleagues, that there will be consequences. Some of this is quite tangible. It isn't all unconscious.
Sorry, I was saying I'm not sure I'd take a different approach to how I would deal with the subject of unconscious bias at a site level and in an office level. I wouldn't necessarily kind of discriminate in that way. I think just picking up on everything that Lynn said, I think she's absolutely right. But I think that approach is equally applicable to at a site level and in an office level. There's an assumption that somehow sites are more coarse than offices might be, but that's certainly not my experience.
Yeah, Jonathan's actually commenting that the more fluid and more fragmented workforce that you get on a site, with lots of different people working for different organisations and for different periods of time, do bring their own challenges, and that's an interesting perspective, I think.
I think again it's about culture. Ultimately, when somebody's, generally for most of the main contractors, if you're a subcontractor working for that contractor on a site, then you're all part of one team, and all employees will be able to access, whatever training or other activity is going on. And I think it's about the culture that you create. And so if a new person starts, that actually they very soon work out what is and what isn't acceptable in the way that we do things around here. So for me, it's just about how that training, how that comms, how that leadership, how your affinity networks, and all of that comes into play. So that when a new person comes in, actually they can see that what is and isn't appropriate.
Thank you. We're getting quite a number of questions and observations in about challenging. Now, the Fairness, Inclusion and Respect programme, Toolbox Talks and so on, gives tools and techniques to challenge, and we discuss them in FAIR Ambassador sessions. But how do we give people the tools to accept challenge? Lynn, could you come in on that, please? How do we enable people to accept challenge?
Yeah, sure. You can give an easy tool to give feedback. You can give an easy tool to receive feedback. The tools are easy. They're not the issue. What needs to make both of those options happen is the permission, and to know you're doing it in the safe environment. And that comes from your leaders and your managers, to know that it genuinely is okay to to say if something's not right, but to know that it genuinely is okay to make a mistake, provided you show a willingness to learn from it. It's that permission. So really, it's the culture that needs to be right first. The tools are the easy bit. The culture needs to be right. Otherwise, people won't be themselves. They won't say what they think, and they'll either be defensive about receiving the feedback or counter-aggressive. It needs to be okay to do both, and that goes with getting the culture right first, and that goes with the managers and the leaders making that happen, and role modeling too.
I think I just agree with what Lynn said. I think it has to be okay for people to put their foot in the mouth. It's lots of people. It has to be a different approach to challenging or addressing that than where people are clearly going a bit kind of beyond that. We used to have in the early days. I remember one organisation published a book of diversity language and words which you couldn't say and what was banned and all this sort of thing. And I don't subscribe to that necessarily, but I do think, again, Lynn is right. It's about having a culture where people are supported and able to challenge, but equally people are comfortable to receive that challenge, but it's done in an appropriate way where people aren't jumped upon for simply saying the wrong word or getting their language mixed up inadvertently. So, which is different. I think clumsiness and inadvertent use of incorrect or perceived incorrect language is different from unconscious bias, which is not the same for me.
The comments that we're getting in, you for ambassadors, it's very interesting. You're clearly drawing distinctions between clumsiness, as Aaron's just referred to it, unconscious biases. Somebody's also asked, what is the difference, if any, between unconscious bias and subconscious bias?
I mean, conscious and unconscious. I think subconscious and unconscious, I would have them as the same. But clearly, conscious is where you are deliberately and actively and knowingly displaying bias and therefore discriminating, and unconscious, whereas it's stuff, as Lynn described, kind of happening in the background. Lynn might have a different view, but that's my take.
Lynn, what is your take on any difference?
Okay, so
subconscious and unconscious bias.
And unconscious, yep. In the context that we're talking about it and using it, no difference at all. The thing has become, because a psychologist will tell you that unconscious bias is not capable of being retrieved without some kind of therapy. You can't dig into it yourself. Whereas your subconscious bias, which is kind of not such a deep level, you can dig into it yourself in the ways that we've discussed in this webinar earlier. So from a psychology point of view, I believe there are differences, but from what's happened is we've coined the phrase unconscious bias to talk about the loss of it, and in a business context it's going to be the same.
Thank you. Some people then are raising the point that actually there is still direct prejudice in workplaces and on sites. And while some of that can be unconscious related, some of it is very conscious as well. Jonathan's asked, any thoughts on managing clash of cultures in the workplace? For example, between different religions and beliefs, and perhaps the transgender community as an example. Aaron, can I come to you on that, please?
I saw this question earlier on, and I'm not sure what was meant by that, and that maybe kind of shows my ignorance. But the sites that I've seen across the sector, I think it's about creating a culture of your own on site. Now, clearly, we want people to be able to come to work and be themselves, and it's about having a culture where everybody feels comfortable, that is inclusive, and everybody feels comfortable to do that. And so, for me, the whole thing around inclusivity is exactly around kind of managing what the question is describing as a class of cultures. But for me, it's about creating that on-site or office or organisational culture, which has its own sense of oneness, whilst managing the inclusivity and the diversity of the different people that are part of it. But for me, that gets to the heart of the whole thing around diversity and inclusion. That's what it's all about, isn't it? And my ultimate point on all of this, I've worked in and around kind of EDI for a long time, and I've reflected on it over the years. And for me, what it comes down to always, you can't make any assumptions about somebody because of the religion that they hold, or the sexual orientation that they have, or the ethnicity or community that they come from. You really can't. It's all about all of us getting to know the people as individuals around us. And the best place to start is those that we perceive initially to be most different from us. And so, whenever I'm talking about this subject, that's always the one thing I try and encourage people to do, is actually don't make any assumptions about any group or any individuals, and just get individuals themselves. And most often you'll find you share more in common than you differ. And again, for me, this is the difficulty with the whole subject of diversity, is diversity gets us to focus on the things about us that are different. And I suppose, multiculturalism and that whole thing, puts us in little groups. Instead, we are many different cultures, and actually an intercultural model seeks to identify those things that bind us together, as opposed to reinforce and emphasize those things that make us different. And so that's my take on that.
Lynn, what are your thoughts around what Aaron's just been discussing? I think that idea about don't make any assumptions is a great one.
In terms of the kind of things to bear in mind, and apologies if it duplicates what he said, this idea about not making assumptions and challenging yourself for objectivity is such an important one. And you don't need to put anybody through any kind of training for that. It's just stop, count to 10, think before you speak. It's this whole thing about, that email you're going to fire off, sleep on it and send it the next day. It's kind of a real version of that. There was one thing I wanted to add in earlier, though, about the whole making the culture conducive, is that a lot of the time on the training that I do, I'll ask people, would you be okay to challenge and be challenged by a peer? And most of the time they say yes. Sometimes they'll say their supervisor or their manager. But if you ask, what if that person was more senior than you? Then the rate goes dramatically down. People seem reluctant to challenge the more senior people. And more senior people, if you ask them, will say that they are absolutely willing to be challenged. But of course, it's testing out that reality, isn't it? But I think this whole idea about open, honest, adult to adult conversations to actually happen up the line, down the line, across the line is absolutely key to what we're talking about this morning, but to the wider FIR issues, which I guess comes back to the inclusive leadership model.
Thank you, Lynn. Absolutely. My big takeaways from this session are that unconscious bias exists. We have to accept that. There are ways of managing it. The way that some organisations manage it is through unconscious bias training, but that unconscious bias training is not a solution to organisational problems or the challenge of a lack of diversity and inclusion in our sector overall. It has to be part of a much bigger picture. Lynn, can I come back to you for one final message? If you to give people one key message to take away today, what would you like that to be?
Okay, I think unconscious bias training or self-learning or e-learning is not a universal panacea. It's also not public enemy number one. It is useful when it's targeted. I think Aaron said that earlier. I think it does definitely have a place in certain key areas. So, for example, if your senior leadership team is very homogenous, which in our industry it very often is, unconscious bias can play a part as part of a wider inclusive leadership program. I also think it has a place in recruitment and selection, as well as building fairness into the policy, like diversity on panels and things like that. So I certainly think we shouldn't write it off, but we certainly shouldn't just put it in willy-nilly. And I totally agree with Aaron, you need to be very careful when you're putting this in, because you're asking people to dig up, their own biases but okay, so we're all digging them up, but actually what happens then? So you need a plan of action around all of this.
Thhank you, Lynn. Aaron, one key takeaway that you would like people to have?
Honestly, I wouldn't say anything different or add anything more to what Lynn has just said. I think that kind of perfectly sums up kind of my take on this. And so she certainly said it better than I could have done. And so I'm happy to leave it there. So just thank you for everybody.
Thank you. That's it from me. That's it for this webinar. Enormous thanks to Lynn and to Aaron for your thoughts, for your contribution, and to all of you FIR ambassadors for all of your thoughts. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend and talk to you all soon.